Welcome. This is an overview of Microsoft's ALM technology. ALM standing for Application Lifecycle Management. And one of the key tools in that suite of tools is the Team Foundation server itself. It handles things like project management, requirements management, test cases, test runs, build automation, version control, very, very important, and then just management information about the development lifecycle and how it's occurring. It's a very powerful tool that covers the breadth of application lifecycle management, the things you need to do to manage your development. Now, as far as administration goes, we need to know a little bit about all of these things, but not in depth. And through this course, we're going to be talking about several areas, especially those that have an impact on the day-to-day administration and management of the Team Foundation server. Now, Team Foundation server itself doesn't act alone. It integrates with things like Sharepoint for showing reports and helping stakeholders understand what's happening in the environment. Other tools like Expression Web and whatnot can integrate with Team Foundation server. Microsoft Office has several key integrations, particularly Microsoft Project and Microsoft Excel, that make integrating and dealing with Team Foundation server simpler and easier for those folks who come from a project management background potentially, or for those people who really want to simply get in and do bulk edits of things. Excel is brilliant for that. Other integrations, one of the key ones is the integration with Visual Studio itself. So TFS and Visual Studio have very, very tight integrations that allow them to work together very, very effectively, especially in that software development piece. Team Web Access is another area where people can go out and use the web to interact with Team Foundation server. The web has a lot of very powerful and dynamic user interfaces that simplify a lot of the things that developers are going to want to do, like drag and drop prioritization of things like requirements. And also something called Team Explorer. Now, we're going to see that a little bit in this course. It's actually a very small version of Visual Studio that has most of the stuff scrubbed out of it, so we can't do any software development and the like. But inside of Team Explorer, as a standalone product, we can do things like manipulate version control, manipulate work items and do prioritization and create queries and those sorts of things. Team Explorer is required to be installed so that we can use some of the Office integration pieces. The good news is, if you have Visual Studio, Team Explorer is already installed. So that's a quick overview of all of the areas that we'll be covering in application lifecycle management and some of the things that we'll need to know about as TFS administrators. As a side note, we've got Visual Studio here, and that's part of Microsoft's ALM technology, but there's another technology that's also very important for most people's software development, at least in the enterprise, and that's Eclipse, for doing Java-based development work or development sometimes on alternate platforms other than the Microsoft platform. Although it's not noted here, we will be also talking about Eclipse and how that integrated development environment also ties very closely with Team Foundation server. So sit back, relax. We've got a lot of great videos coming to walk you through the administration and the how-to of dealing with Team Foundation server and the Microsoft ALM suite of tools. Let's talk about upgrading or installing to Team Foundation Server 2013. Now, whether you're doing an upgrade from a prior version or an install of 2013 that's clean, you're going to be going through the installation process. And so we want to make sure we plan out our infrastructure effectively. Now, there's so much to planning, and you're going to be seeing a lot in the demonstrations to come. So I wanted to cover a few key areas before we get started. And the first is, no matter what we talk about here in this video session, you're going to want to go out and pull down a few key resources and look at them. Now, I've already pulled them open here in this Internet Explorer, so let's open it up and take a look. And those resources, I'm going to start with the download details for the TFS install and administration guides. These are the guides that ship with each version of TFS and walk through the actual installation. Now, these are CHM files. These are basically help files. We can click download. And again, you're going to want to just go and make sure you have your latest version. So I'm going to grab, in our case, we were doing an update 2 installation. Let's grab those 2 files, the admin and the install guide, and click next. That's going to pull those down then from the internet. Do we want to save it? We're going to go ahead and save that one, and we'll save the other one as well. Once the security scan is completed, let's open the folder. Now, here's something that's very commonly a problem when you download these chum files. If I want to look at the install guide, for instance, and I open it up, it's going to say it's from an unknown publisher, and I open it up anyway. It's going to give me my selection here, and I can install. And as I go through and select these things here, I'm getting nothing over here on the right. And that's kind of frustrating because you're expecting to see a bunch of guidance. And what happened there is that it's not currently trusted. So we're going to right-click this, go to the properties, and make sure that we unblock it. Once we unblock it, we'll be able to then go in and see the details when we open it. Let's go ahead and unblock the administration guide as well. Okay, now when we open up the install guidance, we're going to see the full guidance. So this will tell us what we need to do to install Team Foundation Server 2013 Update 2. A lot of detail in here. What are the system requirements? How do we run the installation? How do we configure it afterwards? Just a bevy of really good information. SQL Server requirements, SharePoint product requirements, running upgrades, how do we set it up, etc. Lots and lots of details. Things that we won't be able to cover in the course in detail, such as setting up a high availability farm. We'll talk about scaling it out, but this goes into a lot more detail about high availability. The same is true for the administration guides. That's the install guide. And the Team Foundation administration guide provides similar details for how to administer Team Foundation Server. How do we create a new team project, add members, maintain our servers, etc. Another phenomenal tool to really get us up and running. Now, I do have a couple fairly major issues with both of those. Although they're up to date and they're very nice, it's a lot of information, and it's one of those things where you pretty much need to pick and choose which pieces of it apply to you as part of your installation. We begin installing Team Foundation Server by installing SQL Server. Since we're going to be on 2 different tiers, one for the data tier, one for the application tier, we're going to install SQL Server onto the data tier. To do so, simply open up the disk that you have. In our case, we've got SQL Server installed here, and we're double-click the setup. Once setup begins, we go to the Installation tab, and we can begin the installation. We want a new SQL Server standalone installation, so we'll click that one. If you want to do a failover cluster, etc., please go read the documentation on how to do that. This demonstration will be doing a standard SQL Server installation. The rule checks will show you some of the things if it's passed all of the requirements. There are several requirements for doing the installation, and this will validate that all of these things can be correctly installed. We then move on to the actual installation. We enter the product key, click Next, accept the license terms, and choose to send feature usage that you may or may not choose to do that. And we simply walk through the wizard. We're going to include the SQL Server product updates to get the latest and click Next. Now in our case, we're installing SQL Server 2012. TFS 2013 Update 2 also supports SQL Server 2014, which has a very similar installation. Once the initial configuration is complete, we begin again by walking through and showing the details of all of the things that have been set up and their current status. You may get a warning on Windows Firewall. It's just letting you know that it is going to enable a firewall port access potentially. We then go to Next and do a SQL Server feature installation. Click Next, and we're basically just walking through the wizard. There's a few key areas. We are required to have database engine services and full text and semantic extractions. We also will likely install analysis services and reporting services, as these are required for the reporting capabilities of Team Foundation Server, which are generally used in a base install. One quick note, reporting services is sometimes installed on the TFS application tier because it opens up a web access component, and sometimes organizations prefer to have reporting services installed on the application tier, not on the data tier, for that reason. There are also some shared services here. We're going to skip most of these, but we may want the client tools connectivity. This is especially important if we're not going to install anything on the application tier like the reporting services. We can also scroll down, and there's a few other things that we may want. The management tools complete is to provide SQL Server Management Studio here on this machine. I also believe that's a good default to have unless your organization prohibits it. At this point, we can click Next. And again, we can show details, and it looks like we have several other areas that have passed, and we can go to Next for our configuration. We're going to install as a default instance in this example. You don't have to install in a default instance, but in our case, we're going to. Click Next. We'll do a quick examination of our disk space requirements. Click Next, assuming those come out okay. And we're on our server configuration. We want to change all of these things that can be changed to automatic. And click Next. Next, we're in the database engine configuration. We're going to use Windows authentication mode. Be sure to add the current user. You may also choose to add other individuals who can then administer this TFS. It's important that you have at least somebody here. You can also check out data directories if you need to put the data in a different location. Next, we'll configure the analysis services configuration. We're going to use the default, which is multidimensional and data mining mode. Let's add current user here as well. And once again, we could add additional users if necessary. In the reporting services configuration, we're going to install and configure. And click Next. Now you can choose to install only and then configure manually in the future, but we'll let it do both at the same time. Now with error reporting, you can choose to submit errors to Microsoft if you like. We then click Next. And we can see, once again, all of our configuration rules. Is it ready to install? At that point, we can click Next. We get a summary of all of the installation and what will happen when we do the install. And finally, we can click Install. At this point, the installation begins, and it may take a while. Once the installation is completed, you'll go ahead and you can see some information about the setup. You can scroll down and view that these have all succeeded. There's some logs that have been created for you, and we have now can close this, and we have successfully installed Team Foundation Server or SQL Server to support a TFS installation. Now, as we're installing Team Foundation Server 2013, we have to be aware of both the Windows Server and the SQL Server versions that are supported. So let's take a look at some of those. With TFS 2013, we need 64-bit version of our operating system. It's got to be Windows Server 2008 R2 or higher, so 2012 or 2012 R2. There's also a Small Business Server 2011, and we can install it on that as well. We do have to have a minimum of SP1, however, with both that and the 64-bit version of Windows Server 2008 R2. Now, if we step back in time to TFS 2012, we find that it ran on Windows Server 2008 just fine, and in fact, we didn't have this dependency on 64-bit. We are now fully dependent on a 64-bit operating system. A couple other things we need to think about, and that is SQL Server is one of those. And with SQL Server, we must have the appropriate version. In TFS 2013, that appropriate version is either SQL Server 2012 with a minimum of SP1 and a strong recommendation for cumulative update 2 on top of that, or SQL Server 2014. Now, if you look back in time, you'll see TFS 2012 supports one step back, either 2008 R2 or SQL Server 2012. And if you go back to TFS 2010, you'll see it only supports SQL Server 2008 and 2008 R2. This has implications if we're trying to upgrade from TFS 2010 to TFS 2013. There's a strong chance that even from 2012 to 2013, you'll need to upgrade your database. But coming from 2010, it's a virtual guarantee because 2010 won't run on SQL Server 2012, but you must have that as a minimum for 2013. So these are the SQL Server version support, and we just talked about the Windows version support that's required for a TFS 2013 implementation. We're now ready to install Team Foundation Server 2013 on the application tier. We have installed the analysis services component that's necessary. That's the client server tools for SQL Server. We've also have a Sharepoint in existence that we can leverage. So let's go ahead and install Team Foundation Server. We begin by calling the Tfs Server executable, accepting the license agreement. This does some configuration behind the scenes and a little bit of copying files, etc. And it launches the Team Foundation Server Configuration Center. Now we get to the meat of things. There are three basic types of full installs you can do. The first is a basic install. And in a basic install, you're installing just source control, work item tracking, and build services. It'll automatically install SQL Server Express for you. It's the very tight, compact installation if you want that. It doesn't do SharePoint, and it doesn't do reporting services, etc. This is very often used for small teams who want to get up and running very, very rapidly and don't see the need for some of the reporting capabilities. Additionally, there's the standard single server implementation. This is a more common one you might find for teams between 5 and 6 up to 50 to 100. Commonly use this one. It deploys TFS on a single server, and if you're running on a supported operating system, which means you cannot use SQL or Windows Server 2012 R2, it will automatically install SharePoint Foundation for you. We would have to install SharePoint Foundation ourselves, which we did because we're running on the latest version of the operating system and we need SP1. However, you can see here, standard single server does a couple things that you don't quite get. If you're trying to build out a multi-tier, like an application tier and a data tier one, then you really need to move to the advanced installation. Now, the advanced covers all of the various options, so we're going to walk through the advanced one in this case. And we simply start the wizard. Now, it welcomes, and we can participate in the Visual Studio Improvement Program. I'll click Next. We need to provide an access to the database. Now, we are on a separate tier, so we need to provide access back to the machine that hosts the database. I recommend you click Test in this location. If it's part of an always-on availability group, you do need to check this. Now, you can provide a database label if you want. If you don't, it'll default to TFS underscore. So we have TFS underscore configuration, warehouse, and analysis. We're going to leave all of the defaults and click Next. Now we have an account. This is the service account that TFS will run under. We're going to use this network authority, network service. We're going to click Next. Now, some people do like to use a user account. That's totally up to you. If you do, please refer to the documentation. It has some specific needs for types of security. For instance, it must have run as service enabled. At the application tier, we're going to provide the port and the virtual directory. Unless you have a reason, I would leave them as the defaults. Port 8080 is pretty normal, as well as TFS is the virtual directory. And we move on to the file cache folder. Now, sometimes when you are installing TFS, you're installing it on a server that has a very small C drive and a large D drive for data or something like that. If that's the case, please change this to be a folder on the D drive. This is the file cache folder. So when you're retrieving lots of source control, this cache works to speed things up and reduce the load on the database. So if you have a small C drive, make sure you change this to another location. In our case, we don't have a small C drive. We're going to leave it in that location and continue. Now, do you want to configure reporting for use with TFS? We most certainly do, so we'll continue. If you do uncheck it, you can add it at a later time. And notice that on the left-hand side, all of those configurations go away. We're going to go ahead and expand it back out again and walk through it. The first is reporting services. Where is reporting services located? Once again, we installed that on the database tier. So we'll click that and click populate URLs. That populates the various URLs for us, and we can click next. And then analysis services. Let's click test on analysis services and make sure that we can access analysis services appropriately. Now, this was successful. If we had not installed the client data tools, we would not be able to run this test at this point. It would fail. So you need to make sure you run those. Next, we need a report reader account. The report reader account generally has lower permissions than almost anything else. So we're going to give it a low permission account, and we have one of those set up as the TFS report service. Go ahead and enter the name and the password, and it passes successfully. And click next. Now, do we want to configure Sharepoint for the use of Team Foundation Server? Yes or no? Again, this can always be done later. It doesn't have to be done now. If you don't have Sharepoint installed anywhere, you may want to defer. But in our case, we have it installed. Let's continue. We're going to use the default Sharepoint location. It's right here. This is how it'll integrate. Or we could specify a Sharepoint location of our own. One thing it says, an existing SharePoint installation was found on this machine. It goes ahead and looks for it for you. So we're going to have TFS integrate with this SharePoint farm. Let's click next. Last, it asks us how we want to work with our team project collection. We're going to create a TPC. A TPC is a group of containers that holds team projects. We'll get more into that later. But at this point, we need to enter a name. I'm going to use the default collection name for this example. You'll find it all over the internet as in an MSDN is kind of the default name. A lot of people use it. I recommend, however, that you rename that to something both shorter and more appropriate to your organization. Let's click next. And at this point, we can confirm all of our configuration settings. Click next once again, and it will run all of our readiness checks. Once the readiness checks have run, you can see that it makes sure they all pass successfully. And there's a couple things. Windows Firewall is not enabled. These are some of the warnings. Some of the things are not configured, etc. They will be configured for you if you continue. We're okay with that. So let's go ahead and configure Team Foundation Server. At this point, it runs through the entire process of configuring the server, and it usually takes a few minutes. Once the configuration is complete, you have a success and you're successfully installed with Team Foundation Server. At this point, you can click Next, and it's just really a formality. It kind of lets you know your Team Foundation Server, where you can get access to it, as well as some of the things it did. IIS dynamic compression was enabled, firewall extensions were added, etc. Congratulations, you now have a clean Team Foundation Server implementation. In some cases, you've got a TFS server that for whatever reason you need to scale. You need to bring it out to maybe support more users, or potentially you want to provide failover. And in this case, we're going to create an additional application tier to front-end TFS. Now, SQL Server will use always on, we'll use other techniques to make sure that it's up 100% of the time. However, for the application tiers, we can simply stamp out as many as we need for our TFS installation. So in this demonstration, we're going to walk through scaling out our TFS server or TFS environment by providing another application tier. That gives us 2 application tiers that would then go back to a single database. Now, if you're going to scale it, you're going to need to create a virtual IP, a load balancer, basically, that sits in front and then basically doles out the requests to the 2 TFS servers. Because every organization has a different way of setting up that virtual IP, we're not going to cover that in this demonstration. Instead, this demonstration will focus on setting up that additional application tier to provide that redundancy. First thing we need to do is fire up the Team Foundation server. So let's go in the installation, and go into our TFS Server install and run it. Agree to accept the license terms and click Install Now. Again, there's going to be some copying of files and some installations before we get to the configuration step that we'll be actually installing the application tier. Once the Team Foundation Server installation part is completed, we're getting to the configuration. And this time, rather than setting up a basic single server or advanced implementation, we're simply going to select application tier only. And we're going to do this if we want to configure high availability, or we're trying to move TFS from one server to another, kind of a gentle way for that, or you're restoring a Team Foundation server, kind of a disaster recovery type scenario as well. But in our case, it's because we're configuring high availability, or we're wanting to scale out TFS to a broader audience, a larger audience. Let's go ahead and start the wizard. And it's a very simple wizard to walk through. First thing we need to do is decide whether or not we want to send information to Microsoft. I'll choose yes and click next. And then we need to point to the databases. Now, our databases are on this server, so we can list available databases. You see it was already done for us to begin. And we're going to tie to the TFS configuration database. Now, the reason here is the config database holds all of the information about our TFS environment. So we're going to point here to let it know that we need to scale this up and out. Let's click next. And we're going into the application tier settings, and we're going to provide the service account for use in the new application tier. Now, here's the kicker. In this wizard, as of Update 2, TFS 13 Update 2, this dropdown doesn't have anything other than the administrator, and you can't go in and make a change, or whoever you are logged in as. So we're going to log in and install ourselves as the TFS service. Now, you'll see later that we can go and make a modification to this. But for now, let's go ahead and add ourselves. Yep, it authenticated. Let's move as the TFS service account, or as the service account for this TFS server. The file cache folder, same as before. We can move this to another location. I have plenty of room on the C drive. I'll leave it there. We click next. We review all of the details if you like. Click next. That runs the readiness checks, checks everything. Looks like we're good. There is, again, the note about the firewall. It's going to have to configure that firewall for us. And then we click configure. After it completes, we can see that the configuration completed successfully. We can click next to review all of the details. It tells me it made a copy of my web config, etc. One thing that it notes is the notification URL is set to this. Now, this is pointing to our other TFS server. So I just wanted to note that notification URL is when someone gets, for instance, an email for an update or an alert, and they have a link and they click it, it'll actually bring them directly to that server. And so, again, I mentioned the virtual IP. You'll probably want to front end this with a load balancer and change that notification URL to the virtual IP instead. But in this case, we've installed and configured our application tier. We can click close, close again, and we now have our second application tier set up and configured appropriately. Very quickly, I want to look at that application tier, and you can note just a few things on it. The website, the Team Foundation server, everything's appropriate here. Here's that notification URL we mentioned, and it's still pointing to that other application tier, which is fine for now, but we'll likely want to move that again to the VIP, the virtual IP. Website, web access URL, same thing. It's on the other server. Now, I mentioned we can now change the account. Unfortunately, when we installed it, the service account was set as the login, the administrator. I'm going to change that account. And at this point, we can now move to use something like network service, or if we have a domain service account, we can use it there. So be sure you then configure the account to match the same service account. This goes ahead and makes all of the changes for us. Once it's done, we can click close, and now the service account is set appropriately for this application tier. So in this demonstration, we have gone through installing a second application tier, pointing it back to the same configuration so we can scale out our environment. One caveat, you have to install the service during the wizard as whoever happens to be logged in, and immediately after that, you should go change that service account to match the rest of your TFS installation. If you have remote offices, it's often a good idea to install a TFS proxy server at the remote office to speed up source control operations with Team Foundation Server. Now, don't do it unnecessarily. I've worked with lots of organizations that have had offices as far away as India from the United States, and in those cases, the bandwidth was good enough and they didn't even need the proxy server at all. However, in some cases, there's high latency or poor bandwidth between offices. And in this case, you really want a Team Foundation proxy server installed at the remote office. Now, one quick note, the Team Foundation proxy server only supports version control operations. In other words, things like work items are not cached. That's still a full call back to the Team Foundation server. In general, that's not really much of a problem, as version control operations make for a vast majority of the network traffic. Now, one other area that I think the proxy server is very important, potentially even more important than remote offices, is putting it in front of a build server. If your build server is constantly making gets from TFS, and those gets are complete get all rather than incremental gets, which is the default with most Visual Studio Team Foundation Server builds, you're going to find a lot of traffic based on just getting that build running. In fact, in a lot of organizations that have build servers running in continuous integration modes, for instance, I see that up to 90% of all of the traffic and all of the load against Team Foundation Server is generated by the build servers themselves. You can eliminate the vast majority of that by simply setting a proxy server in front of the TFS server. So the build servers instead connect to that proxy server. So let's see how we would install a proxy server. It's much the same way. I've got a nice machine here, clean machine, and I'm going to log into my DVD or tie into my DVD and run the TFS_server install. Now this is common. Everything seems to be run from this. We're going to accept the license term, install now, and it's going to copy all the files to the local cache and do some installation work. Once the install is complete, the configuration center is launched, and rather than install Team Foundation Server, we're going to install the Team Foundation Server proxy. Let's click Start the Wizard, and we're going to simply walk through the proxy configuration. Do you want to participate in helping improve Team Foundation Server? I think you should. And then we need to connect to a team project collection. Now, one thing to note is in this wizard and in the UI, you can only connect to one Team Foundation server. But in reality, the proxy can be connected to many Team Foundation servers. We'll show you how to do that in a later module. Let's browse to that connection. And we've got our server located at this address. And we're going to connect to the default collection and click Connect. That'll connect to this TPC. We go next to get to the service account. Let's use the NT Authority Network Service. You can check out the advanced configurations if you want. This is just the authentication methods. I'm going to stick with NTLM as it is by far the most common implementation. Next, we set up some proxy details. Two important things here. The first is the port. The default port is 8081, very commonly used. All of the MSDN documentation or any help you would read will point to that port, but you can change it to be anything you like. Also, more importantly, is the file cache folder. This is where it's going to put the cache. Now, proxy servers don't have to be very powerful, but they do have to have room on a hard drive. So you want to point this to a hard drive that has plenty of room. The recommendation here is at least 50 gigabytes. I think that's a good recommendation. You might want to go even larger if you have a very large TFS server. I'm going to leave it here in the C drive. I think that's fine. We can go in here. We can review all of our settings. Click Next. It'll run through the readiness checks. Looks like we're good to go. And we can click Configure. This will actually do the install and the configuration. The configuration was successfully completed. Let's click Next. That completes our installation of the proxy server. Now, before we leave, I'm going to close this out, and I want to go to the Team Foundation Server Administration Console. And if we go to the, if we look up here, we can see the proxy server, and I click on the proxy server, and I can see some details about the proxy server. And I mentioned that file cache folder. One way to change the file cache folder is right here in the file cache folder link. And we could change this to the D drive. We could move it to something like C:\data if we preferred. We can kind of do whatever we want by changing the file cache location here. This is available in 2013 and later. This was not available in 2012. In 2012, you made this change inside of a configuration file. And again, we'll see that later when we configure the Team Foundation Server proxy to work with multiple servers and other things. So in this demonstration, we learned how to set up and install and why you may install a Team Foundation proxy server. Once you've installed Team Foundation Server, you want to make sure it's a rock-solid installation. So how do you do that? First thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the Team Foundation Server Administration Console. So I'm going to open up that, and we start right at the top. And we're going to do a kind of a walkthrough just to make sure everything looks good. Now we note that we've got Team Foundation Server 2013 installed. We've got the license type, all of those sorts of things. Not quite as important. Let's walk into the application tier. Now, this is where we start to see some information about our installation. So we'll see the service account, the website, the application pool, what authentication mechanism we're using, etc. Our notification URL. By the way, if you do have a scaled out implementation, you'll need to change this to be your virtual IP address generally. You have your server URL, almost always left to localhost. And you have your web access URL. How do people get to your web access? Now again, you may want to change this to a friendlier name potentially in your network, and then once you've done that, you would change this here so it will accept that new URL. The machine name, the ports, the virtual directory, all of these things are things that you may or may not need to have. Now, next thing you want to do is take a look at the administration console users, and you may want to add other users here as well. If you add another user, it'll give them admin rights on this TFS environment. The email alert settings, you may want to configure that, make sure those are set up, the data tier summary, etc. We'll get the summary of all of the things here, and any application tiers. In our case, we've got a scaled out implementation with 2 application tiers. And last, some of the reporting services summary. So you just want to get an idea of what those things are and make sure everything looks right. You may want to go take a look then at the individual team project collections. Now, on the install, we only have 1. And if we look at the team projects, we should have 0. We'll be showing how to install a team project in just a moment, but if you needed some refresher, how to add a team project here is a good thing to note. We'll look at any SharePoint web applications. We notice we've got one, and here's the connection between the two. We can look at reporting and see that everything is configured and the jobs are enabled. Looks like we're solid. And if we've installed lab management, that would be here. Now we haven't configured that, so we'll leave it as is. Now we don't have a proxy server installed here. No build server installed on this machine. And we can check the extensions for SharePoint products because the SharePoint is installed on this application tier. And we can do a verification of any scheduled backups we have and any details around those backups. Looks good. Everything's looking pretty good for our Team Foundation server. But there's one last thing we want to do, and that's the thing that stresses TFS end to end, and that's create a new team project. So what you're going to want to do to validate the install, the final step in this validation, is to actually create a team project. And to do so, we're going to need to go into Team Explorer somewhere, either with Visual Studio or without. So let's move to another machine that has Visual Studio installed. Now that we're on a machine with Visual Studio installed, we're going to want to open Visual Studio. And we've already configured Visual Studio to point to this Team Foundation server. And once you're here, we can click this again to connect, and we can create a new team project. I use this little plugin looking thing to get to this connect window, and we're going to create a new team project. Now, if you wanted to, you could click select team projects and just verify you didn't have any. But I'm going to go directly to creating a team project. Now it's going to spin this project up on our default collection. So I'm going to give this team project a name, and we'll call this the verification project. It's just going to spin it up just to verify that TFS is up and running appropriately. We can then delete this team project later. In fact, we'll destroy it so its existence is forever gone. But we don't need to do that necessarily. I'll click Next, and then I'm going to walk through this. Now, I'm going to select a process template and some other things. As part of this verification, we don't need to pay too much attention here. It can really be any process template. What we do want to do, though, is make sure that we are creating a new SharePoint site, because that's going to stress the SharePoint creation. And we're also going to want to make sure that we select some kind of version control. I'll use Team Foundation version control. At this point, we can do some of the verification and click Finish. This will start the process of creating our new team project on the server. Excellent. Our team project has been created successfully. We can launch our process guidance for more information. We don't need to do that. We can simply close it. We have now validated that we've been able to create that new team project, which basically stresses that end-to-end TFS implementation. So in this demonstration, we've verified that we've got a good, solid TFS implementation or installation in an environment. And we've also walked through a little bit to kind of understand what's in that management console as well. Users of TFS often want to be alerted when something happens inside of TFS. So for instance, if work is assigned to me, I'd like to know. Or potentially if a build fails, I'd like an email sent to me. That's done through the TFS alerting process. And in order to enable that, as an administrator, we need to set up the SMTP service so that it can happen. Now, you're going to need something that can serve up SMTP. I'm going to show you as an example how I'll set it up here. Let's open up the TFS administration console. And on the application tier itself, as we scroll down, one of the things we're going to find is an email settings section. Here you'll notice that enabled is false. We can set up that alert by clicking on alert settings. I'm going to click alert settings. We then say enable email alerts, and we provide the name of the SMTP server. In my case, I'm running a test MTP server called Papercut that's available free on Codeplex. It's just for an example. Once we set up that SMTP server and the port, we need to provide the send from address. Now, it's a good idea to provide an address name that people can recognize. I'll call it TFS Alerts. And for the authentication to the SMTP server, we can use the TFS service account. Yeah, might work, might not. We're using NT authority, so it's a little bit, or network service, so it's a little bit sketchy. We'd have to probably do some configuration on our SMTP server. We could also send it as a specified username, or it may not be required that we authenticate. We'll send with the TFS service account in this case, and there's an advanced setting where we can add a certificate thumbprint if we need to do that for our SMTP server. Let's click OK, and at that point, we are enabled, and we can go over and click the send test email to validate. I'm going to add the send to address. I'm just going to send that to myself, and you can add a message text. It's just optional. It already includes some text. So let's click OK to send that message. Email was successfully sent to the configured SMTP server. And if I go down, I can validate that that was the case. Once again, I'm just simply opening up Papercut. It's just a development SMTP test agent. And I can go to the test mail and see that yes, it was sent from the appropriate place to the appropriate place on the appropriate date. It just gives me this default test settings here and the message itself. So in this demonstration, we've gone into Team Foundation Server in the application tier, and we've enabled email alerts by pointing to an existing SMTP server on our network. Often when you've installed SharePoint on your TFS server, or you have SharePoint installed externally somewhere, you might not like the URL. For instance, the URL that we have on ours, if we open the administration console, is SRV19428. Whack sites, whack default collection, whack project name. That SRV19428 might be very difficult to remember. So we can change the access mappings so that we have a different URL, a friendlier URL. Now this requires some additional changes beyond what I'm showing you here. You also need to go and make a change in your DNS, or maybe add a CNAME in your domain, something that will point to that new URL. But this is how we set it up inside SharePoint. So let's go take a look at that. Go to Central Administration and go to Application Management. And inside Application Management, we have this Configure Alternate Access Mappings link. If you click that, there's 3 links at the top: public, internal, and external resources. We're going to edit the public URLs for the default website. Now, if this doesn't say what website it is, you can drop down and change the access mappings to select the default website. Here's our internal URL. I can see the internal URL here, but what I'd like to do is edit our public URLs. Now, I'm going to leave our default. This could be our default URL. You could change it to whatever you want. For our intranet, this is local. Let's use the Team SharePoint. That can be our link. So instead of typing SRV19428, we'll simply type Team SharePoint, whack sites, whack default collection, etc. We also might have an internet, and that might be exposed to the internet, and that might be Tfs SharePoint.myco.com, something like that. We might have that URL if we happen to have something that's reaching out like this to exposed to the internet. If we don't have an internet URL, we can easily get rid of that. We can create a custom one and an extranet as well. You can have up to 5 basically. And what it does is it lets SharePoint know that when somebody comes in and accesses Team SharePoint, that it really means that it should go to SRV19428. So let's go ahead and save that. There's one other area that you need to make a connection, and that's in the IIS manager. So we may want to start that. And inside the IIS manager, we can go to our default website. That's where SharePoint is currently hosted. And from here, we can right-click, and we see all of our various contexts. One of those is Edit Bindings. And we can specify that the Team SharePoint is port 8080, or is port 80 here as well. So we need to make sure we specify it here in addition to that location in SharePoint. So in this demonstration, you've seen how to configure the alternate access mappings inside of SharePoint. Now, before we can install Team Foundation Server on the application tier, we need to ensure that the application tier can communicate with the data tier, especially the analysis services engine on the data tier. To do that, we need to install the SQL Server client access tools on the app tier. Otherwise, later on in the installation of TFS, we'll run into an error. So let's go ahead and do so. First thing we need to do is attach to the correct ISO, the SQL Server ISO. And when it automatically kicks off the install, let's go to Installation and click the New SQL Server Standalone Installation or Add Features to an Existing Application link. Now this sounds very heavyweight, but we're not going to actually be installing all of SQL Server, just the client access tools. You can view the details of the setup support rules. Click OK. Once you're into the SQL Server setup, enter the product key, click Next, accept the license terms, decide whether you're going to send usage data to Microsoft, click Next, decide whether or not to include the SQL Server updates. I always recommend you do so. Click Next, and it'll go ahead and extract those updates and validate the setup for you. Once the setup prerequisites are done, you can show the details, see all of the various things, make sure they're green, and click Next. And we're going to do a SQL Server feature installation. Click Next. And we're going to select the features that we want. Now, we're not going to install any database engine or anything like that. Instead, we're going to select Client Tools Connectivity. These are the things that allow us to communicate between this machine and the data tier, especially when we're trying to communicate with the analysis services portion. Click Next. You can see the details on anything that all of the checks that occurred. Click Next. It'll calculate the disk space. Next. Send error reports to Microsoft if you so choose to do so. Click Next. You can see the details. Everything's passed, ready to go. We're ready to install and install. Once the installation is complete, you can click Close. And we've now installed the Client Tools connectivity that's required for analysis services on for the application tier to talk to analysis services on the data tier. Upgrading your Team Foundation server is something you're probably going to have to do. Now, if not now, then in the future. But you may have an old version of TFS that you want to upgrade. Now, there's a couple different approaches. The first approach is to simply take your existing infrastructure and upgrade it in place. You just uninstall the app tier, reinstall the 2013 app tier, and it automatically runs the upgrade for you. Another way is to move to new hardware. And this is often done, especially if you're upgrading from a different version of SQL Server or the like. And then you're going to be moving over to a new set of hardware. Those are remarkably similar. And so we're going to walk through that demonstration, and I'm going to do a hardware move migration. But during that, we're going to be talking about how to do an in-place migration just the same. Now, there's one other thing that you might do, and that's if you have two different installations of TFS, one at 2013 and one at 2012. You may want to upgrade your team project collection from 2012 to 2013. To do that, you can simply disconnect it, detach it from 2012, and then attach it to the 2013 infrastructure of TFS, and that will automatically run the upgrade that way as well. We're going to stick with the more traditional upgrade approach in this upgrade demonstration, where we're going to take the configuration database and the team project collection database and upgrade them in one go, rather than leaving out the configuration database and moving simply a detached collection. So let's get to it. Now, the first thing we need to do is we need to go into our SQL Server, and we needed to back up our databases on the old server, and we're going to bring them into the new server. So I'm already at the new server, and I've copied them over already. So I have two databases we're going to grab and copy over. So to do that, I'm on the databases on my nice, clean SQL Server. Let's right-click it, and we're going to restore a database, and that's primarily because I'm pulling them from backups. So you'll see here, there's nothing in here that I can find. I'm going to go to Device and browse to my particular file that I have. And the file I've copied over into the backup directory, and it's the configuration database, TFS configuration, and TFS nwc.back. We're going to take both of these. First, the configuration database. So I'm going to add that one and do the restore of my configuration database. I'm going to restore it back to TFS configuration, so we should be good just the way it is. Okay, the configuration restored successfully. So you can see we now have the TFS configuration database over here. We're going to repeat that process by restoring our backup from the collection. Let's grab the collection, TFS_NWC. We're going to grab that collection, and we're going to restore it into the same database name and let it do the restore. Now, once again, as a reminder, step 1 was to back these things up from my old TFS server. Just taking those 2 key areas and then bringing them across to the new location. It restored successfully. Let's click OK. And now we have our TFS configuration and our TFS NWC databases in the new environment. So just want to make sure we're very, very clear. Back up from a TFS 2010 or 2012, our collection and configuration databases, and simply restore them on the new SQL Server. Don't have to do anything but that. Now, a quick note. If we were doing an in-place upgrade, we wouldn't have to do any of that. We would be right here, right now, in exactly this position where we have our configuration database and any associated TPC databases. So you can think of this as doing an in-place upgrade as well. They're really identical. Now we need to go and install and configure an application tier. Let's go do that. And to do that, we need to move over to another virtual machine. All right, I've moved over now to my other virtual machine. This is going to be my application tier machine. And on this machine, we can run the installation of Team Foundation Server. And to do that, we simply go onto our box. We can Windows Explorer into it and grab our TFS installation, run the TFS Server Installation. And all we're doing is running the TFS install. This will do the upgrade for us. Now, this is because I'm doing a migration upgrade to a nice new environment. If I was doing an in-place upgrade, I would simply uninstall Team Foundation Server 2012 or 2010 prior to running this install. That's the only difference between the two. So let's accept the license terms and go ahead and install. All right, welcome to the Upgrade Wizard. Choose whether or not to participate in the Experience Improvement Program. Click Next and define our databases. We have to give it the location for 19430. That's where our available databases will be. Here's our upgraded database, TFS configuration. Sorry, the not yet upgraded database. We're going to check this to confirm we have a backup. You need to confirm you have a backup and go next. And now we're just basically setting up our application tier, just like we did in any other of the install demos we've done. So here's our application tier settings. Let's click next and use NT authority. File cache folder we'll leave there. Reporting, we can set it up just the same as we've done before, where it'll set up reporting services, etc. But let's do something a little crazy. I wanted to show you how to do it not configuring this and configuring reporting later. There are occasions where sometimes you'll get a backup that's you don't have the TFS_warehouse, is in our case. We're going to generate that automatically. Normally, you'll simply walk through the upgrade process and include reporting as well. But it's nice to see different approaches. And in our case, we're taking just the 2 core databases, configuration and the TPC database, and we're doing the upgrade there, and we're going to generate our own TFS_reporting or warehouse reporting piece. So let's do that later. Let's click next, configure SharePoint. Yeah, let's go ahead and do SharePoint. Now, here's the thing. If you're doing an in-place migration, you can very often use the current SharePoint settings. If you're doing a migration where you're leaving behind your entire infrastructure and moving to brand new infrastructure, then it's going to be slightly distinct and you're going to change settings to point to a different SharePoint farm. I'm going to go out and test this new SharePoint farm and the administration URL, and I'm going to be moving my stuff to a new SharePoint farm. So if you're doing an in-place upgrade, use current SharePoint settings. If you're doing a migration upgrade where you're moving to new hardware, that's the only time you're going to be pointing to a different SharePoint farm. And in fact, you still might use the same setup if you're not moving your SharePoint farm as well. In our case, we're moving our SharePoint farm, so I want to point it to the new SharePoint farm. Click Next. This gives us kind of a review of what we have. And then we can click Next again, and that'll run our readiness checks. All the things look great. Let's click Configure. And during this process, it's going to prepare the configuration, work with SharePoint, work with our databases, and basically upgrade everything in our site. All right, after that, the configuration is done. You'll see it's gone through several things, prepared the configuration, worked with SharePoint, the configuration databases. All of those things are now upgraded and ready to go. But we've got one more step, and that's to upgrade the actual team project collections. And this can take a while. Whereas this is relatively quick and finishes in minutes, sometimes the next step can take hours. In our case, we have a relatively small one, so it should go quickly. Let's click Next, and we can see that we have 905 servicing steps, of which 13 are so far complete. And pretty soon that'll start marching its way across, and we'll get to several that take a long time. And those are where we're upgrading the database. But here's where all of the upgrade process is now occurring. Once the wizard has gone through all of the upgrade processes, then you're set and you're ready to move forward. And we can click Next. At this time, we get a detailed summary of what's happened. And we can click Close. And there's our link to our Team Foundation server. Let's hit Close. And now take a look at what's happened. Everything seems to be working. It configured that, plus the extensions for SharePoint because it was running locally. And we have completed our upgrade. Now, as a quick note, this one demonstration covers two things. A migration upgrade, which is what we've done, but also an in-place upgrade because they are so similar. In an in-place upgrade, you simply aren't going to have to back up and restore your databases. You simply say upgrade. But in both cases, you're going to be installing the new Team Foundation Server application. You'll uninstall TFS 2010 or 2012, and you'll install TFS 2013, and it'll just reach to the databases and run the upgrades. Once we're here, we have now completed our upgrade. Many times, you're going to want to move from a different system into Team Foundation Server. So how do you do that? Well, there's a few things you need to know. First, moving version control, if you're moving the tip, just the latest version, is very easy, and that's what we're going to show in this demonstration. If you're trying to move history of version control, much more difficult and beyond the scope of what most TFS administrators do. That's more of a consultant or an expert's job to do that type of migration. Additionally, you might want to move work items. Again, there are several tools that you can use to move work items. The TFS integration platform available on Codeplex does a few, and there are third parties who can move from other systems like Quality Center into TFS or other sorts of systems. Again, that normally is beyond what a TFS administrator would do. So in this demonstration, we're going to talk about moving just version control from one system into Team Foundation Server. And we're going to use the Team Foundation Server version control to do so. So let's get started. Now, the first thing we're going to note, I'm going to open up some source control. We have something called Tailspin Toys here. And if I open it up, we can take a look at some of the code inside of it. And it's embedded pretty deeply down here. And I've got the code in main that I am most interested in. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we've got here. And let's open this up, this Visual Studio solution file. Now, if you're moving from another system, it'll say, hey, the solution you're opening is bound to another version control system. Do you want to try to rebind? In our case, since we're migrating, we say no, absolutely not. So it'll tell us, all right, it's got some source control bindings in the solution, but we're not going to use them. Well, that's fine by us because we're going to add version control bindings at this point. So it's going to load the solution, bring it all up into Visual Studio, and we can go from there. Now I'm going to minimize this property window so we can get a little bit bigger view, and let's take a look at that solution. And you can see the solution is made up of lots of different projects here. We've got a web, a model, a SQL repository, a schema, maybe an administration app here, a lot of different things. But what we want to do is add this to our version control system. Now, let's do so. I'm going to go to Team Explorer, and note that I've created a Tailspin Toys team project. This is just a standard team project, and it's based off of Team Foundation version control. I'm going to use Team Foundation version control for this example. So if we go into something like the Source Control Explorer, you're going to see that under Tailspin Toys, we don't have anything. We're not mapped to any local environment. We just sitting right there, we just have an empty version control repository. Let's go back to our Solution Explorer and add it to version control. And we can do that by right-clicking the solution itself and choosing Add Solution to Source Control. It's as simple as that. Let's click Add Solution to Source Control. In this case, we've got Team Foundation version control. We'll click OK. Where do we want to put it? Well, here's Tailspin Toys, and we're going to want a solution folder underneath that. We'll call it Tailspin Toys, but really we want something in between these two, and that's going to be our main branch. And I want to make sure we put this into main because we'll be branching potentially to dev environments and to release environments as we go. So let's put everything under main, and the solution folder we're going to drop under that will be called Tailspin Toys. And let's click OK. What that is going to do, it's going to bind our solution now to source code control. Now, if we look up here, we're going to see a little plus next to the main, and we can open it up a little bit and dive in, and we can see we have our Tailspin Toys, and basically our entire repository is all laid out with the little plus sign. Now, plus sign means it has not yet been committed, so nobody else can actually see this. So let's go ahead and right-click our solution, and we can check into version control. A couple other things we can do. Let's take a look at source code. We can get a specific version, undo pending changes. There's some advanced stuff we can do. But in our case, we're simply going to check in. And we go to check in, and when we're doing the check-in, there's a few things you do need to note. Take a look at the included changes. We've got 413 included changes. These are all of basically the files that we have. And we can minimize the included changes, and we can look at the excluded changes. So we may want to, there are 36 additional things in here, potential adds. We can take a look at those and see that we've got like license.txt, Octopack new, it's a NuGet repository tool for Octopus deploy. Let's take a look. We've got an install PS1. We've got a bunch of these things that it says, yeah, these probably don't belong in version control. But the reality is many of them do. As we're making a migration from one version control system to another, we're basically checking out of one version control system and checking into the other. So if we want all of these things in TFS, we're going to promote all of those items so that they're added to this included items list. So it's very important to add those excluded changes into the included changes. One quick caveat, if you have done an automated build, or a local build, an F5 build, anything, you might have a bin directory or a debug or an obj directory. You're probably going to want to not include those in version control. But if you're just doing a pure git and then bringing it to version control, great. And it works out just like a champ. Just make sure you include the right changes. We can take a look at those included changes, and let's enter a check-in comment. For us, the check-in comment will be initial commit of main branch, and let's click check-in. Now, we're prompted with a check-in confirmation. You may or may not want to keep this. I don't feel the need for a check-in confirmation, so I usually check don't prompt again, and yes. That's going to commit and check in all of those items into version control so that we've now promoted those into Team Foundation Server. The change set was successfully checked in. If we go now and take a look at our Source Control Explorer, we find that under main, we have Tailspin Toys. All of the items are here. Everything is currently checked in. Works brilliantly. That's how you would migrate a Visual Studio solution from another version control right into Team Foundation Server. In this demonstration, we're going to be looking at how we can upgrade a team project. Now, you've already upgraded the team project collection, but there's differences between TFS 2010, for instance, and TFS 2013, or differences between 2012 and 2013. And we're going to need to resolve those issues if we're going to be able to use all of the new features in that team project. Now, one of the misconceptions is that once you do an upgrade, it's completely unusable until you do these upgrade steps. That's not true. We can create work items, we can just delete work items, we can make changes to them, we can edit them in Visual Studio, but there are some limitations, and a lot of those limitations come in the web access. Now, luckily, with the advent of TFS 2013, there's a lot of upgrade stuff that happens for us automatically without us really even needing to look at how the process behind the scenes works. But in this demonstration, we're going to show you how to do it cleanly, but also when there's a problem. So let's start by opening up our Team Foundation Server Administration console. And we just brought in this Northwest Cadence team project collection here. And if we look at the team projects underneath it, you can see we have several team projects. Now, each one of these team projects is going to need to be upgraded independently of all of the other ones. So let's start by looking at one, say HR Payroll, and seeing what we can do to upgrade that one. Now, if we want to use the automatic upgrade, we can go to Internet Explorer and simply browse out to that location where we would normally get the website. So let's go to TFS, this is the website, and let's go into that HR Payroll application. Now, in HR Payroll, we can go and view code and see the differences in code, etc. But what we care about here is going into work. And we haven't seen anything pestering us about upgrades here. And that's because nothing has really changed that dramatically in this team project between the way TFVC worked in 2010 and the way TFVC works now. That's Team Foundation Version Control. However, when we go to work, it says, I'm sorry, this feature cannot be used until you configure it for this team project. Now, I'm coming from 2010, and what that means is we didn't even have any sense of this Agile backlog that we could use in the web. So we need to configure this feature. If we configure this feature, it'll pop in and it'll say, here are the features that have not been configured for this project. And if you read carefully, you'll see there's things like code review. We need to add the appropriate work items for code review. There's my work. There's feedback, the feedback request, feedback responses. There's storyboarding links. There's portfolio backlogs that are not enabled. Something called shared parameters that were introduced. All of these things aren't enabled yet. So we're going to select verify to see if they can be configured automatically. And what it does, it inspects it and says, hey, it looks like we can automatically do this. And we're going to configure it using the following settings. Now, it came from an old MSF for Agile process template, so it's going to upgrade us to MSF for Agile Software Development 2013.2. Upgrade's maybe a little bit of a stretch. It's not going to make it this template. It's going to take settings from this template and apply them to ours. It says a few work item types may be added. Some existing ones might be modified, but none of your data will be changed. This is clean. This is easy. We push configure, and it configures those features for our team project. All right, everything's been applied. We can learn more about those enabled features here, and we can learn about some additional configuration here. Let's learn about those enabled features. I want to make sure we have a firm understanding here. Here are the new features that were enabled, and you can see here that we've got a test plan, a test suite, etc. Modifications made, shared parameters were introduced, portfolio backlogs, planning tools, code review, all of those things that we saw earlier are now lit up and enabled for us to use. Now I'm going to close this out again and go back, and we can learn more about some additional configuration options that might be useful as well. So we can see here, after we've run through it, we'll have all the latest features, but we can still make some additional ones. We might want to do test plans and test suites, especially if we're going to 2012.3. We've got updating workflow for specific work item templates. There were changes that were made between the Scrum product backlog items, for instance. So if we want to optionally make our work items look more like they are in the latest version of the process template, we can go ahead and do so. And this basically walks you through some of those additional configurations and how you might want to work with them. In most cases, however, you'll leave it as is. You've enabled all of the new features, you're ready to go, and frankly, your process was working before, it's working now, it hasn't changed much except for the new additional features. So now we can go in and we're at this payroll and we can push F5 on our server. And in we are. Now we have our backlog, we can start adding user stories, etc. But let's take a look at a different one. I'm going to close out of the stories one here, and we're going to go back to our home, and we're going to go into MyCalc. Now, MyCalc has a very similar problem. It has not yet been updated, and we can't upgrade it until we configure this project. So let's type configure feature or click on it, and it'll again give us this piece, and we'll verify that it can actually do this upgrade on its own. Now, this is an edited process template. There were changes made to this process template that broke the ability for TFS to do the upgrade for us. So what we can do are two things. We can do it manually, or we can figure out these errors, fix all of these errors, and then rerun this wizard. Just simply click that link again and let it rerun. Very often, I've got to be honest, the easiest way is simply to correct some of these problems. Like, for instance, there's no story point field in the user story. And that's because I got rid of it for part of this demonstration. So we could go in and add that back in, as well as some of the other areas as well. So like the story points was missing. It doesn't have any way to consider what the effort is. But if you decide not to do this and you want to do it manually, you can click the Learn How to Configure the Features Manually. Now there is a pretty substantial list of things you need to do these manually. And you do them with tools like WIT Export, WIT Import, which are covered elsewhere in the course, and making modifications to the work items themselves, as well as making modifications to some of the process metadata. So here's the updates if we want to use the portfolio backlogs. As an example, we're going to need to get the process template.xml, check out the version number, but the idea here is we need to copy this feature XML from a later version and upload it into our team project. We're going to need this feature work item type. We'll also need to make some changes once we've done the features. We need to go into the process configuration files, etc., and make appropriate changes. Those are just one of the changes we have to make. And you can see there's several others. What if we wanted to use shared parameters? In this case, we're going to make all of these changes. Basically, I'd encourage you to go review this entire document. It gives you how to do this manually, and it's important as an administrator that you understand the fundamentals of what's happening underneath the covers, even if you actually just simply use the automated approach to upgrading your team project. Once we have a configuration of lab management set up, it's time to start using it. And to that end, we're going to set up an environment template that we can use. Let's start off in MTM. So we're at a client machine at this point, and we're firing up Microsoft Test Manager, and given the appropriate permission, we're going to go into the lab center. Now, very often you'll start in this testing center. Make sure you hit this little drop down, move to the lab center, and then we can begin work. You'll default to this lab tab right up here, and you'll see an environments here where you can create new environments or deploy an environment from a library. What we want to do first is create environments in a library. That creates that template that we want to use. If you hit new here, quick gotcha, you're going to create an environment, but as soon as you close it down and throw it away, it's gone. It's not a template that we can reuse again and again. To do that, we walk over here and we click this library tab right here. Now we can set up new environments. Now I'm going to click new environment, and there's a couple of Things that we need to fill out. We need to provide ourselves a name here. And this is going to be we'll call it our Skillsoft demo environment. And you might have a description and give it some tags as well. We'll click Next, and this is where we will select the machines. And the machines are going to be available for this team project, HR Payroll. It's the one that we are currently in. We're going to keep it linked to this team project. But you'll notice we don't have any virtual machines in here. And that's because we're pulling these from a particular library in SCVMM, the System Center Virtual Machine Manager. We need to import some of those virtual machines so that we can use them. Now, when we click Browse, when you click Import in here, it'll bring you to an entirely new form where we can create and import some virtual machines. Let's browse for a virtual machine. We've got this TFS Lab 1, and we're going to grab that one and add that machine. Now it's going to let us know, watch out, we need to make sure it's joined to a work group and not an Active Directory domain. There's more information here. We'll call it TFS Lab 1, and we can specify, if we like, a default role. We're going to say this is going to be a server. It's going to sit on a server role. We can specify some machine properties, or rather look at the machine properties. These, again, would be changed in SCVMM. We click Next, and we get a quick summary, and we click Finish to go ahead and pull that in. Now this can take a substantial amount of time because it's actually working in SCVMM. Okay, we've done the import and it's brought us back here, but we don't currently see it. Let's go to our previous step. There's no refresh. So let's go back in and take a look at what some of those virtual machines might be in that template. Yep, here we have our stored virtual machine, which we got to, and we were able to import it. Go back to an environment. So let's create a new environment again. Hit Next. And this time we're going to see it. It's a pity we didn't have a refresh. Or I guess the refresh was here, just a little bit gray. I came in and re-went through, but now we have our machine that we want to be part of our environment. We can then add that to our environment. Click Add Environment here, and we have our TFS Lab 1 acting as a server as part of our environment. Now, we don't have to stick with just one machine. I'll go in and add another machine by walking through that same import process so we get a couple of machines potentially. There we go. Let's grab our base one, and we're going to add that to the environment. So we have actually two machines as part of our environment. Let's click Next. We can then look at the machine properties for each of these by selecting them and then looking below. Once again, we need to use SCVMM to change those. And then we have some advanced properties that we can look at. Test controller to run on this environment. What test controller do we want? I've got one here called TFS 2010, which I've upgraded. We're going to go ahead and use that one. Do we want network isolation? Do we want to be able to run UI tests? We can leave all of those things as they are. Get a quick summary and click Finish. We now have created a brand new environment. And at this point, there's a couple of things that need to be done in our environments. We've got this preparation phase, this preparation for the environment here, and deploying the file using the local area network. So it's going to pull it across the LAN and make sure we're all set to go and everything's in our VMM environment. This can, again, take a substantial amount of time sometimes, but we simply wait it out, and then we will have our environment. Okay, it's done. Have a pretty fast network here. And you can see the Skillsoft environment is now stored, and we are ready to go with this environment. So in this demonstration, we have now set up an environment template that can then be reused from our lab tab. We can go in here and we can deploy an existing environment. That was a template. We can select this template, give it a name, and deploy that environment now, and potentially deploy our application into it, remote into it, and do all of those other things. So in this demonstration, you've seen how we set up those environment templates in a library.